There's a door the church has kept locked for 2,000 years, and Baruch Spinoza found the key. Do you know that feeling, that something isn't quite right? That inexplicable unease, when you hear the story of the crucifixion, like vital pieces are missing from the jigsaw puzzle. Your instinct is correct. It always has been. What you're about to discover will shake not just everything you've been taught about Jesus' death. It will reveal how 2,000 years of history have been deliberately falsified, how humanity's greatest conspiracy happened right under our noses. Because there is a lost gospel, a manuscript the church fought for centuries to destroy, a document that reveals not only who really betrayed Christ, but a web of corruption so deep it would forever alter our understanding of power, religion, and human nature. And the discovery didn't stop there. Spinoza found physical evidence, coins with suspicious inscriptions, correspondence between Roman officials, records of financial transactions that shouldn't exist, a trail of proof the church tried to erase completely. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why Spinoza was expelled from his own community, why his books were burned in public, and why, even after death, he was considered the most dangerous man in Europe. Pause for a moment. Close your eyes. Imagine everything you believe about the crucifixion is only half the story. Amsterdam, 1677. Baruch Spinoza is dying. His lungs are failing, but his mind remains sharp as a razor. In his final days, he entrusts a close friend with a small, dark wooden chest. "Burn everything," he whispers, "except this." But why such paranoia? Why was a respected philosopher so terrified of his own discoveries? The answer lies in the previous 23 years. Since 1654, Spinoza had become obsessed with a seemingly simple question. If Jesus was truly divine, why were the accounts of his death so contradictory? He started as any scholar would, comparing canonical gospels, studying original Aramaic texts, analyzing historical inconsistencies. But the more he investigated, the more questions arose, and the answers he found terrified him. Inside the chest, manuscripts Spinoza collected during 2 decades of secret investigation, texts that should never have survived, gospels the early church tried to completely destroy, documents he obtained through a clandestine network of scholars who risked their lives to preserve the truth. Have you ever wondered why Spinoza was really expelled from the synagogue in 1656? The official version speaks of heretical opinions about God. But recent investigations reveal something much more specific. He had begun asking dangerous questions about discrepancies in the accounts of the crucifixion. Rabbis in Amsterdam received letters from Christian authorities, letters demanding that Spinoza be silenced, not for questioning God's existence, but for investigating the veracity of specific historical events. The expulsion wasn't about theology. It was about preserving millennia-old secrets. But here's what almost no one tells you. Spinoza wasn't just a philosopher. He was an obsessive investigator, a detective of historical truth. And he had a unique advantage. He was a Jew living in a Christian society. He could move between communities that normally did not communicate. For 20 years, he built a network of informants, disillusioned monks who found suspicious manuscripts in monastery libraries, Jewish merchants who transported ancient documents between European cities, even some cardinals who, discreetly, questioned inconsistencies in the official narrative. The question that haunted him was simple, but its implications were explosive. If Jesus was truly innocent, why did Pilate, a calculating politician, order his execution? Why would a Roman governor, known for his extreme caution in local religious matters, risk his career for a Galilean carpenter? Pilate had governed for 10 years without major incidents. He knew perfectly the political volatility of Jerusalem. He knew that unjust executions could cause revolts that would reach the emperor's ears. Why then did he yield so quickly to the pressure of the Pharisees? The traditional answer never convinced Spinoza. Popular pressure didn't explain why other political prisoners had been released in the past. Fear of riots didn't justify why the execution was carried out so publicly and humiliatingly. Spinoza suspected that crucial information was being omitted, motivations that transcended religion and politics, and he was absolutely right. For years, he followed clues all over Europe, secret correspondence with scholars in Rome, Constantinople, and Alexandria, clandestine contacts with librarians from remote monasteries who had guarded secrets for centuries. He knew that the first centuries of Christianity were a bloody battle between different versions of the truth, and that the victors always write history. In 1665, after 11 years of meticulous investigation, Spinoza finally gained access to what he was looking for: a manuscript secretly copied from a Vatican secret archive by a cardinal who had lost faith in the official version of events. The document reached him through an improbable route. A Venetian merchant transporting spices from the East carried in his cargo a disguised chest. Inside, texts that had been declared lost centuries ago. The merchant didn't even know what he was transporting. He was simply following instructions from an anonymous benefactor in exchange for a considerable sum of money. When Spinoza opened the first manuscript, his hands trembled. It wasn't just a gospel attributed to Judas Iscariot. It was a detailed account, written in Aramaic and Greek, containing specific conversations, names of people involved, and the most shocking thing, exact values of financial transactions that nobody should know. But this Judas told a story that turned everything Spinoza thought he knew upside down. There was no betrayal. There were no 30 pieces of silver. There was no kiss of death. Instead, there was something far more sinister, a calculated murder to cover up the greatest corruption scheme of the ancient world. The manuscript began with a sentence that haunted Spinoza for the rest of his life. "What they will say about me will be a lie, but I carry this lie so that the truth about my master may survive, even if hidden." Do you feel that change in your breathing? That involuntary acceleration of your heart? It's because a part of your mind already recognizes the truth, even before your conscious mind fully processes it. Judas didn't write his gospel as a justification. He wrote it as testimony, as evidence for future generations who would one day dare to question the official version of events. Have you ever wondered why only 4 gospels survived? Why, out of more than 50 Gospels written in the early centuries, only Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were considered true? Who decided that? And what happened to all the others? The answer will shock you. In the 4th century, Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, officially to establish Christian doctrine, unofficially to control the narrative. Hundreds of texts were declared heretical. Their immediate destruction was ordered. Possessing a copy was a crime punishable by death. But some survived, hidden in monastery walls, buried in deserts, guarded by families who passed the secret down through generations. And Spinoza found one of them. The secret gospel of Judas doesn't speak of betrayal. It speaks of sacrifice, of a plan that Jesus and Judas orchestrated together, of a truth so revolutionary that it would threaten not only the power of the Church, but the entire political structure of the Roman Empire. Feel how your breathing has changed, how something inside you recognizes that this isn't just another conspiracy theory. Your instinct is right. What Spinoza discovered has evidence that was deliberately suppressed. In the manuscript, Judas isn't the traitor. He's the most courageous disciple, the only one willing to bear the burden of appearing a traitor so that Jesus' plan could be completed. Because Jesus didn't just want to die for the sins of humanity. He wanted to expose the corruption that had infected both the temple and the palace. But here's the real shock. The gospel identifies the person really responsible for Jesus' death. It wasn't Pilate acting alone. It wasn't just the Pharisees. It was a conspiracy involving high priest Caiaphas, temple merchants, and a select group of Roman collaborators. Jesus didn't die for blasphemy. He died because he uncovered a corruption scheme involving millions of denarii. The Temple of Jerusalem wasn't just a religious center. It was the central bank of Israel. It controlled the exchange of foreign currencies. It charged astronomical fees from pilgrims who came from all over the empire, and a significant portion of that money mysteriously disappeared through a network of false accounts. But here's the detail that will shock you. Judas's gospel contains specific numbers, exact amounts that were embezzled during the years Jesus was preaching. We are talking about the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars today, a scheme that involved not only high priest Caiaphas, but a complex network of Roman officials, influential merchants, and even members of Herod's family. Jesus discovered this scheme through Matthew. Yes, the same Matthew who wrote one of the canonical Gospels. Before becoming a disciple, Matthew was a tax collector. He had access to financial records that revealed massive discrepancies between what entered the temple and what was officially declared. For months, Jesus and Matthew meticulously documented these irregularities: names, dates, amounts, money laundering methods. They weren't just preaching love and forgiveness. They were building the biggest criminal case in ancient history. That's why Jesus expelled the money changers from the temple with such fury. It wasn't a spontaneous act of religious indignation. It was a premeditated public denunciation. He was symbolically showing the people that their religious leaders were organized thieves, that the system was corrupt from its most sacred foundations. Imagine the terror this caused, not only in the religious leaders, but in the Roman politicians who received regular bribes from this scheme, in the merchants who facilitated money laundering, in the aristocratic families who lived luxuriously with funds diverted from the offerings of the faithful. Jesus wasn't just an inconvenient preacher questioning religious interpretations. He was a real economic threat. An investigator who had uncovered enough evidence to bring down the entire established power system in Jerusalem. The Gospel of Judas reveals private conversations between Jesus and his disciples that never appear in the canonical texts. Detailed plans that show a strategic side of Jesus that has been completely censored from the official narrative. Jesus knew he would be killed. He had information that a conspiracy was being plotted against him. But he wanted his death to serve a greater purpose, to publicly expose the corruption and create a crisis that would force an independent Roman investigation. The plan was of a cruel genius. Jesus would be publicly betrayed by Judas. But in reality, this betrayal would be staged to protect the other disciples and ensure that at least one of them survived to tell the true story. Judas volunteered to carry this terrible guilt, but there was a second part of the plan that Spinoza considered even more impressive. Jesus had hidden copies of all the evidence he collected about the corruption scheme. Documents, financial records, signed testimonies, everything stored in secret locations that only Judas knew. The idea was simple. After the crucifixion, when the dust settled, Judas would reveal this evidence to the Roman authorities. He would prove that Jesus was murdered to protect criminals, and he would force Rome to investigate and punish the real culprits. And Judas agreed to be hated forever, agreed to carry the eternal guilt so that Jesus' message could survive, and more importantly, so that justice would eventually be done. Because they knew that if the true story was told immediately, it would be censored and its followers would be massacred. But the plan failed at a crucial point they hadn't foreseen. The conspiracy against Jesus was even bigger than they imagined. It involved levels of power they never suspected. And when Judas tried to reveal the evidence, he discovered that there were no honest Roman authorities to turn to. Everyone was compromised. Spinoza spent the next 12 years obsessively verifying every detail of the manuscript. He cross-referenced information with Roman historical texts that no one else had correlated. He studied economic records of the temple, discovered in recent archaeological excavations. He analyzed correspondence between authorities of the time found in private archives of European aristocratic families. And the most impressive part? Spinoza found confirmation from completely independent sources. A Roman centurion's personal diary, unearthed in the ruins of Pompeii, mentioned financial irregularities in the Temple of Jerusalem and special orders concerning the Galilean carpenter. A Roman administrative document from Pilate's governorship, preserved in Alexandria, spoke of political pressures related to local economic investigations. Even contemporary Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius left vague yet disturbing references to disorder in Jerusalem related to monetary issues and political executions disguised as religious matters. Spinoza discovered that the temple's corruption scheme moved the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars annually in today's money, that high-ranking Roman officials received regular payments to turn a blind eye, that some members of the Sanhedrin possessed personal fortunes utterly incompatible with their official salaries. More shocking still, he found evidence that some of Rome's aristocratic families had direct investments in the temple's business, influential patricians who funded operations in Jerusalem in exchange for percentages of the profits. The corruption wasn't just local, it was international. Jesus uncovered all this through his network of contacts, tax collectors, honest merchants, and even some temple scribes who were being pressured to falsify records. For months, he meticulously documented every suspicious transaction, every accounting discrepancy, every irregular payment. He wasn't just preaching the kingdom of heaven. He was building a detailed criminal investigation that could topple the entire political and religious elite of his time. And he had enough physical evidence to prove every accusation. He discovered that the corruption scheme in the temple moved the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's money, that Roman officials received regular payments to turn a blind eye, that some members of the Sanhedrin had personal fortunes incompatible with their official salaries. Jesus discovered all this, and he had evidence, documents, witnesses. He wasn't just preaching love and forgiveness. He was building a criminal case against the religious and political elite of his time. That's why he was killed, not for blasphemy, but for exposing corruption. And the story of Judas's betrayal was created to cover up the real motives, to transform a political assassination into a religious drama. Spinoza knew that publishing this discovery would be literal suicide. He had already been expelled from the Jewish community for questioning minor religious dogmas. Publishing evidence against the foundations of Christianity would mean simultaneous persecution by Jews, Catholics, and Protestants. In a Europe where religious wars had devastated entire populations, there was no safe place for someone who threatened all established faiths. But he couldn't live with this secret. He couldn't accept that the truth would be buried forever while billions of people lived based on an elaborately constructed lie, so he developed a preservation strategy he called sowing the truth. Spinoza began to deliberately plant clues in his philosophical texts, seemingly innocent references that only other very attentive scholars could decipher, hidden codes in his discussions on biblical interpretation, strategic citations that, when connected, revealed his true discovery. In his work, Theologico-Political Treatise, he writes something that seems innocuous about reinterpreting sacred texts based on external historical evidence and archaeological documentation. But contemporary scholars realized he was saying something revolutionary. He was suggesting that the official scriptures omitted crucial information that could be recovered through independent investigation. In the same work, he makes a seemingly casual observation about the need to distinguish between political narratives and spiritual revelations in ancient texts. Again, a phrase that could go unnoticed, but which was actually indicating that biblical events had been deliberately politicized to serve specific interests. The Church understood the threat immediately. Cardinals in Rome began exchanging correspondence about the danger of Spinoza to the stability of faith. Spinoza's books were banned in France, Spain, German states, and various Italian cities. Copies were publicly burned in the squares of Paris, Madrid, and Naples. But the persecution went beyond censorship. Spinoza began receiving direct threats. He found his house being watched by unidentified men. He received suspicious offers of protection from local authorities in exchange for cooperation with investigations into his writings. Even some of his closest friends began to avoid him, fearing being associated with his dangerous ideas. In 1673, 4 years before his death, Spinoza was officially invited to lecture at the University of Heidelberg, a seemingly prestigious offer, but one he immediately rejected, because he knew that accepting would mean placing himself under the direct control of authorities who could monitor and censor every word he spoke publicly. But they knew. They knew that Spinoza had discovered something dangerous, something that could shake the foundations of ecclesiastical power. And they did everything to silence him. When Spinoza died in 1677, church agents ransacked his house. They were looking for manuscripts, compromising documents, and they found the chest, but it was too late. Spinoza had already spread copies of the Gospel of Judas to other scholars. The truth had escaped. Over the following centuries, this information circulated in very restricted circles: Enlightenment philosophers, independent historians, researchers who risked their careers to preserve censored knowledge. Voltaire knew of Spinoza's discovery, Diderot too. They never spoke openly about it, but they left clues in their works, encrypted references for those who knew how to look. The question you must be asking yourself now is simple. If this is true, why have you never heard of it before? Why isn't this information in history books? Why isn't it taught in universities? The answer is simpler than you think. Because some truths are considered too dangerous to be widely known. Because there are powerful interests that benefit from the official version of history. And because questioning certain narratives still has consequences. But do you notice how your mind is changing as you listen to this? How are the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that never made sense finally falling into place? This isn't coincidence. It's the recognition of truth. The Gospel of Judas doesn't just reveal who really killed Jesus. It reveals how power systems work, how narratives are constructed to protect interests, how the truth is buried when convenient. And this didn't just happen 2,000 years ago. It's happening today. Official narratives hiding inconvenient truths, information censored because it threatens established powers. People silenced for asking uncomfortable questions. Spinoza knew this. That's why he didn't publish his discovery openly. He understood that the truth needs to be preserved, but revealed only to those ready to receive it, to those who have the courage to question what they've always accepted as fact. And now you are part of this select group, people who know the truth about Jesus' death, people who understand how history was manipulated to hide corruption and protect the guilty. But this is only the beginning. Because the Gospel of Judas reveals much more than the truth about the crucifixion. It reveals secrets about the early years of the Church, about how Christianity was transformed from a revolutionary movement into an institution of power, about secret deals that shaped the religion we know today. Are you prepared to know the rest? To discover how the early church made a pact with Rome that forever changed the course of history? To understand why some Gospels were preserved and others destroyed, because once you know the whole truth, there's no going back, there's no unseeing what you're about to discover. The door that Spinoza opened can no longer be closed, and on the other side of that door is a truth that will forever transform your understanding of power, religion, and human nature. Take a deep breath, because what I'm about to reveal goes beyond Jesus' death. It will explain the birth of the greatest control system in human history. The Gospel of Judas contains a second part, a part that Spinoza considered even more explosive than the first, because it doesn't just talk about how Jesus died. It talks about how his teachings were hijacked, how his revolutionary message was transformed into a tool of domination. 3 days after the crucifixion, something extraordinary happened that would change the course of human history. Not just the resurrection, you know, but a secret meeting that sealed the fate of the truth for the next 2,000 years. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin who had given his tomb to Jesus, urgently met with Nicodemus and other influential Jewish leaders in a safe house on the outskirts of Jerusalem. On the surface, it was just a conversation about how to contain the unrest caused by Jesus' death. But Judas's manuscript reveals the true agenda of that 3-day meeting that changed everything. They realized they had made a colossal mistake. By murdering Jesus, they didn't destroy his movement. They transformed it into something infinitely more powerful and dangerous. They transformed an inconvenient investigator into a revolutionary martyr. And martyrs, as any seasoned politician knows, are far more dangerous dead than alive. Jesus' followers were spreading a version of events that directly implicated the entire Jerusalem elite. They spoke openly about systematic corruption in the temple, about million-dollar money laundering schemes, about political murder disguised as religious execution. If this version spread throughout the Roman Empire, it would literally be the end of them all. Worse still, Jesus had left physical evidence, detailed documents about financial irregularities, signed testimonies from honest merchants, records of fraudulent transactions, and some disciples knew where this evidence was hidden. It was then that Joseph of Arimathea had an idea that Spinoza called the most brilliant political coup in human history. If they couldn't destroy Jesus' movement or erase the evidence he collected, they would do something far more sophisticated. They would take control of the narrative. If they couldn't erase Jesus' message, they would completely rewrite it. The strategy was of brilliant perversity to transform a criminal investigation into a religious movement, to shift the focus from earthly justice to celestial redemption, to convert political denunciation into spiritual promise. Joseph of Arimathea was more than a wealthy religious leader. He had commercial connections that extended throughout the Roman Empire. He controlled trade routes. He had political influence that reached all the way to senators in Rome, and he knew exactly how to use these resources to control information. Joseph of Arimathea sought out Peter not as an enemy, but as a potential ally in a desperate situation for both sides. He offered something the disciples desperately needed: physical protection, substantial financial resources, and political influence to spread Jesus' teachings throughout the empire without being persecuted as criminals. But there were specific and non-negotiable conditions. The story of Jesus' death needed to be fundamentally retold, less political, more spiritual, less about earthly corruption, more about celestial redemption, less about social injustice, more about individual salvation. And crucially, someone needed to bear the blame for the crucifixion, someone who was already dead and couldn't defend themselves or contradict the new version of events. Someone whose sacrifice would allow everyone else involved to escape the consequences. Judas Iscariot had hanged himself 3 days after the crucifixion, not out of guilt or remorse, as the official version would claim, but out of utter despair. He knew that the plan he and Jesus had devised had completely failed, that the truth would be buried, that the evidence would be destroyed, that he would be remembered not as the bravest disciple, but as the most infamous traitor in history. And that's exactly what happened. Judas became the perfect scapegoat for a conspiracy that involved dozens of powerful people. Peter, facing real threats of imprisonment and execution, with the other disciples terrified and without resources to continue the mission, finally accepted the agreement. The official story would be completely rewritten. Jesus would die for the abstract sins of humanity, not for denouncing the concrete crimes of specific authorities. Judas would be presented as a cowardly traitor, motivated by greed, not as a courageous martyr who sacrificed his eternal reputation for the greater good. But the most perverse, the focus of the movement would change radically. Instead of denouncing earthly injustices and fighting for social transformation, Christianity would teach acceptance of earthly suffering in exchange for promises of heavenly reward. Peter had no real choice. It was accept the deal or see all the disciples executed, and Jesus' message completely erased. At least this way, some version of the teachings would survive, even if fundamentally distorted. The Gospel of Judas describes Peter's agony in making this decision, how he wept for 3 days before accepting, how he knew he was betraying the memory of Jesus, but felt there was no viable alternative, how he carried this secret guilt for the rest of his life. Do you feel the weight of this revelation? How a lie told 2,000 years ago shaped billions of lives? How a false narrative became the foundation of an entire civilization? But the Gospel of Judas reveals something even more disturbing. The deal didn't stop there, because Joseph of Arimathea had connections that reached all the way to Rome, and he knew that controlling the nascent Christianity could be far more lucrative than destroying it. In the following years, the Christian movement grew exponentially, but it grew in a very specific direction. It emphasized obedience to authority. It preached conformity with established power. It taught that the true reward was in heaven, not on earth. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's became more important than drive the money changers from the temple. Jesus' revolutionary message was carefully edited, transformed from a cry of revolt into a whisper of submission. For decades, this new version of Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, and Rome noticed something fascinating. This religion did not threaten imperial power. It reinforced it. It taught the people to accept earthly suffering in exchange for heavenly promises. In 313, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, officially out of personal conviction, unofficially because he realized he had found the most effective tool of social control ever invented. Think about it. A religion that teaches people to obey earthly authorities, to accept injustices without rebelling, and to focus on rewards in the afterlife. To an emperor, this wasn't a religion, it was a political strategy. The Gospel of Judas describes secret meetings between Christian leaders and Roman authorities during the 3rd century. Negotiations, agreements, compromises that defined which version of Christianity would be officially accepted and which would be persecuted as heresy. Gospels that emphasized Jesus' social message were burned. Texts that spoke of radical equality were destroyed. Documents that questioned established authority disappeared forever. Only the Gospels that told the right story survived. The story that transformed Jesus from a political revolutionary into a spiritual savior. That shifted the focus from earthly justice to heavenly redemption. Spinoza realized that this wasn't a natural evolution of Christianity. It was a deliberate manipulation, a social re-engineering executed with surgical precision over 3 centuries, and it worked perfectly for 1,000 years. The official version of Christianity kept entire populations submissive to kings and emperors. It taught that earthly suffering was virtue, that questioning authority was sin, that the true life began only after death. But a few knew the truth. Secret groups that preserved forbidden gospels, scholars who guarded censored documents, philosophers like Spinoza who risked everything to keep the flame of authentic knowledge alive. During the Inquisition, hundreds of these guardians of the truth were burned alive, not for witchcraft, but for possessing gospels that told a different story, for knowing that Jesus was murdered for denouncing corruption, not killed for our sins. The Church knew exactly what it was doing. Every auto da fe, every public execution, every book burned was a calculated act to erase evidence, to ensure that only one version of the story survived. But they couldn't erase everything. The Gospel of Judas survived. Fragments of other forbidden texts were preserved, and brilliant minds like Spinoza continued investigating, questioning, discovering. In the 18th century, Spinoza's discovery began to circulate discreetly among Enlightenment intellectuals. Voltaire used this information to question the power of the Church. Diderot incorporated insights into his critique of organized religion, but they never spoke openly about the source, because they knew that revealing the complete truth would cause a revolution, not just religious, but social. Billions of people would discover that their faith was built on a lie, that their obedience was manipulated, that their submission was programmed. During the 19th century, archaeologists began to find more evidence, papyri that confirmed details of the Gospel of Judas, documents that corroborated Spinoza's version. But these findings were quickly lost or locked away in private archives. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices in 1945 was a crucial moment. 52 early Christian texts, including Gospels that had been lost for over 1,000 years, and several of them confirmed elements of Spinoza's discovery. But notice how these discoveries were presented to the public as historical curiosities, as interesting alternative perspectives, never as evidence that the official story was fundamentally wrong. The narrative control machine evolved. It no longer burns books in public squares. It simply labels them as non-canonical or without theological relevance. It no longer executes researchers. It simply questions their academic credibility or marginalizes them professionally. But truth has a strange quality. Once revealed, it spreads on its own, like water finding cracks in the rock, like light seeping through the crevices of darkness. And now you know this truth. You know that Jesus wasn't betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. He was murdered for exposing systemic corruption. You know that Judas wasn't the cowardly traitor, but the most courageous disciple. You know that the Christianity you know was deliberately manipulated to serve political interests. The question now is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Spinoza faced this same choice in 1677. He could have published everything, revealed the complete conspiracy, exposed 2,000 years of institutionalized lies, but he knew it would cost him his life, and maybe change nothing. So he chose a different path. He planted seeds. He left clues for future minds to discover. He trusted that the truth would find its way through the generations. And it did, through Enlightenment scholars, through courageous archaeologists, through independent researchers who risked their careers to preserve censored knowledge. And now it has reached you, not by chance, because you are the kind of person who questions official narratives, who seeks inconvenient truths, who has the courage to look beyond the surface of things. But remember something crucial that might have gotten lost amidst all these revelations. This isn't a story about Christianity versus atheism. It's not an attack on genuine faith or authentic spirituality. It's a revelation about how power systems always manipulate narratives to control populations, how inconvenient truths are systematically buried when they threaten established interests. The original message of Jesus about radical justice, true equality, and love that transforms social structures remains completely valid. What Spinoza discovered doesn't diminish that message. In fact, it rescues it from millennia of distortions. It shows that Jesus was even more courageous, even more revolutionary, even more dangerous to oppressive systems than we ever imagined. He didn't die to save us from abstract sins invented by theologians. He died trying to save us from concrete systems of economic exploitation and political domination. He didn't preach passive submission to established power. He preached active resistance to institutionalized injustice. He didn't teach celestial escapism that ignores earthly suffering. He taught earthly responsibility that transforms celestial realities. This is the truth that Spinoza preserved at the risk of his own life. The truth the Church hid to protect political alliances. The truth that Joseph of Arimathea and his successors tried to bury forever because it threatened not only their wealth, but an entire world system of domination based on false narratives. But here's something that should leave you simultaneously hopeful and vigilant. Some truths are bigger than the systems created to suppress them. They're like seeds of ancient trees, buried in the harshest winter of history. They sleep through entire seasons of darkness, but they always find a way to the light when conditions are right. And now, at this exact moment you're listening to this, you've become part of that light that transcends millennia. You carry a truth that survived 2,000 years of systemic censorship, organized persecution, and institutional manipulation. A truth Spinoza risked everything to preserve. A truth that cost the lives of hundreds of courageous people throughout history. The Gospel of Judas isn't just a fascinating historical document about ancient events. It's a mirror that reflects how power always works in any era. How narratives are deliberately constructed to justify injustices. How lies repeated with sufficient authority become accepted truths without question. And if this happened to the most important and influential story of Western civilization, what else is being hidden right now? What other truths are being buried to protect powerful interests? What other official narratives that you accept without question are just carefully edited versions of much more complex and disturbing realities? Think about the implications of this for the modern world. How many official truths do you believe simply because respected authorities repeat them constantly? How many convenient narratives have you never questioned because they seemed obviously true? How many times might you have been manipulated in the same way billions of people were manipulated about the death of Jesus? These are exactly the questions Spinoza wanted to plant in your mind. That's why he preserved the Gospel of Judas with such care and personal risk. Not just to reveal truths about the distant past, but to awaken in you the critical ability to question all the truths imposed upon you in the immediate present. Because in the end, Spinoza's greatest discovery wasn't about events that happened 2,000 years ago. It was about patterns that constantly repeat themselves in all periods of human history. About how to recognize when you're being manipulated right now. About how to distinguish truth from propaganda in a world that profits astronomically from your ignorance. The door the Church kept locked for 2,000 years is now completely open. You've walked through it. You've seen with your own eyes what was hidden on the other side. You've discovered that some of the most important events in history were deliberately falsified to serve specific political and economic interests. But now comes the most important part of this entire revelation. What are you going to do with this knowledge that has changed your life forever? How are you going to use this expanded awareness to navigate a world full of official narratives that may be hiding equally explosive truths? Spinoza faced this exact same crucial crossroads in 1677. He could have tried to publish everything openly, exposing 2,000 years of institutionalized lies all at once. But he knew that would cost not only his life, but perhaps wouldn't fundamentally change anything in the established power structures. So he chose a much more intelligent and lasting path. He planted seeds of truth that would germinate across generations. He left precise clues for future minds to discover. He trusted that authentic truth always finds its way through the centuries, even when it faces massive resistance from systems interested in suppressing it. And that trust proved to be absolutely justified. The truth found its way through Enlightenment scholars who questioned established dogmas, through courageous archaeologists who risked careers to investigate inconvenient evidence, through independent researchers who refused to accept official versions without solid evidence. And now that truth has reached you, not by mere chance or casual coincidence, but because you are exactly the kind of person who questions official narratives when they don't make complete sense, who seeks inconvenient truths even when they disturb comfortable beliefs, who has enough courage to look beyond the polished surface of things and investigate what might be hidden beneath. You now possess something that very few people in history have had: direct knowledge of how great truths are systematically hidden, distorted, and manipulated to serve specific interests. You understand the exact mechanisms by which false narratives are transformed into accepted historical facts without question. This isn't just interesting academic information about the distant past. It's a powerful tool for understanding the immediate present, to recognize when you're being manipulated, to distinguish between authentic truth and sophisticated propaganda, to keep your mind genuinely free in a world that invests trillions of dollars annually in controlling how you think about reality. The truth about Jesus and Judas that Spinoza preserved doesn't need your permission to be valid. It doesn't need the approval of authorities to be true. It doesn't need institutional authorization to transform lives and expand consciousness. And perhaps, just perhaps, you're starting to realize something even more liberating. The door you imagined to have been locked for 2,000 years was never really locked. The keys were always in your hands. You just needed to develop enough courage and genuine curiosity to question why you'd never tried turning the knob. Now you know the truth, and the truth, as Jesus really taught before his words were distorted, doesn't just liberate, it empowers. It transforms. It reveals that you have far more power to question, investigate, and discover than any system of control wants you to believe. The conspiracy that buried the truth about Jesus for 2,000 years continues to operate today in different forms, but with the same fundamental goals. And now you have the mental tools to recognize it and resist it. The implications are staggering. Spinoza's work provides a roadmap, a critical lens through which to examine the power structures that shape our understanding of history and reality itself. Think of it as a detective story, but the case is the very fabric of our belief systems. The stakes are incredibly high. What we believe profoundly shapes how we live, and Spinoza's insights provide a path toward genuine intellectual freedom, a freedom to question, to explore, and to ultimately to define your own truth. This isn't simply about historical accuracy. It's about reclaiming your agency in a world that consistently tries to control the narrative. It's about understanding the insidious ways in which truth can be manipulated and buried, and developing the intellectual resilience to uncover it, to resist it, and ultimately to become a powerful force for change in the world.